Hey everybody. So I've been getting a lot of questions about this, so I thought I would do a quick video and explain. For those of you who are not familiar with how executive orders work, what's wrong with my hair here? So executive order. As you likely know, but let's do a refresher of our government. We have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, which is the president and his cabinet and federal agencies that are under those cabinet heads. Then we have the legislative branch, which involves Congress, both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then we have the judicial branch, which is all of the courts, federal courts, and we're just talking about the federal system here, federal courts around the country, and the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, as we like to call it for short. And so the president has the power within the executive branch to issue what are called executive orders. And executive orders they do have the effect of law and are enforceable only within the executive branch of government. Okay, so the president has no authority to legislate. So the president cannot draft new laws and impose them on the other branches of government or on U.S. citizens, only with respect to the operations within the executive branch. So he can order the federal agencies to engage in certain activities. He can delegate basically tasks or responsibilities within the executive branch. So executive orders do not supersede government contracts, for example. So if somebody has a government contract with one of the federal agencies under the executive branch, and an executive order comes out that is contrary to a previous agreement that is in force, that executive order cannot retroactively impact that contract. A contract is a negotiation, and it's an arm's length agreement between two parties or more than two. And so in order for the terms of that agreement to have to change, the parties would have to mutually agree generally. Now, this would depend on the terms of the contract, but generally under contract law, you would need both parties to come to the table and renegotiate the terms and sign a new agreement agreeing to those terms. You can't just unilaterally change an agreement, and the president certainly has no authority to do that. Even if we have someone in the office right now, he may act like he has that kind of authority. Also, executive orders can be reviewed for legality and constitutionality, just like laws coming out of Congress. And so if, for example, an executive order violates the U.S. Constitution, that it can be overturned by SCOTUS, which is where it would end up ultimately on appeals. Someone would come sue in federal court, and it would have to be somebody with standing. So standing means that they've been injured basically by the action, by the executive office or executive order. And so maybe it's an agency implementing that order and somebody's negatively affected by it. And so they would then bring action in federal court and challenge the constitutionality of that executive order. And then ultimately it would be appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court does not have to take cases. It basically gets to select the case that it wants to take. And so no one has a guaranteed right to be heard in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And if the U.S. Supreme Court refuses to hear it, then the lower court, which is generally the U.S. Court of Appeals, that ruling, whatever that court's ruling was, is going to stand. But if SCOTUS takes it on, which is called accepting cert, certiorari, then the Supreme Court will basically interpret the executive order and determine whether or not it is unconstitutional. And so the other way that you could challenge an executive order is by arguing that the president basically overreached and tried to engage in this legislative function, which is not within his powers under the Constitution. And so if it was an illegal act by the president because he did not have that authority and he was attempting to legislate like the legislative branch, that would be another basis for overturning the executive order. And just as a refresher, The president cannot legislate. If he wanted there to be some new law, and this does happen where presidents will work with their team to draft legislation, and they will then collaborate generally with people in Congress to present the bill, to basically sponsor the bill in Congress, whether it starts in the Senate or starts in the House. So the president can certainly have an influence on legislation, can be a part of the negotiation process, can be very influential in what laws are basically drafted, sponsored, and brought to the floors for voting. But he cannot issue a law that would be technically considered legislation. And again, you're legislating if you're trying to force Congress to do something, forcing the courts to do something, or trying to force American citizens to do something. He can only promulgate executive orders that would be enforceable as against the executive branch. So anything beyond that is overreach and could be overturned as illegal. And so then the legislative branch is Congress. They are the ones that basically draft and pass legislation. So all the statutes that are passed come out of the legislative branch. And of course, the president is the one that has to sign them into law. So there's always this connection and relationship between the branches, but technically these branches are meant to be checks and balances against each other. So no one has absolute power within our government. And then the judicial branch is separate from the other two. And the judicial branch is meant to interpret the laws, either the executive orders promulgated by the president or legislation promulgated by Congress. And generally they're looking through the lens of the legality of that legislation or executive order, or the constitutionality of it. So generally they're going to be interpreting whether that statute and the implementation of it by someone in the government, because generally, again, you have to have standing, so you have to have somebody that's been injured by the implementation or enforcement of that unconstitutional law, right? That's the only way you get into court, is if you have standing. So you have to wait till there's a victim, basically. I think there'll be plenty after this last week with all of the different firings that have been going on and changes within the executive branch because of this flurry of executive orders. So there's going to be a lot of people that have standing because they have injury. It's like an injury in fact. That's a legal term. And I guarantee you, there will be lawyers taking up these cases. Lots have been filed already this week, but that's going to be a whole thing over the next 4 years with Trump in office. And so anyways, I just wanted to sort of remind you guys all about the three branches of government, how they're all meant to work together. And the judicial branch, one other thing about it is you hear a lot of debate, particularly when people are up to be, nominated for and confirmed into the Supreme Court. This idea of originalism versus legislating from the bench, if you've heard these phrases. And the concern is always you don't want what are considered activist judges, and that's always up for interpretation, who are attempting to enforce novel laws. So they're trying to legislate from the bench. Typically and technically, the judicial branch should merely be interpreting the Constitution and interpreting laws and not promulgating their own laws. However, it is inescapable that when a court renders a decision at any level, but particularly the Supreme Court, it becomes law. It is law because it may be interpreting a statute or interpreting an executive order, but it is clarifying generally. It's either overturning the law or it's clarifying how that law is to be interpreted. So it is adding another layer of clarification about that law. So in essence, and so, for example, sometimes justices at the Supreme Court will come up with like a 5-factor test that has to be used in order to determine whether a statute has been violated. And in that case, that 5-factor test that was not in the original statute drafted by Congress, but has been literally come up with by the courts, is part of the law because it then is how that statute becomes interpreted and enforced. So the judicial branch absolutely creates law. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It is an absolutely integral part of what they do. But we're always looking for making sure that the three separate branches are not in any way encroaching upon the authority that is invested or vested in each separate branch, right? So the legislative branch cannot engage in actions that are reserved for the executive branch. The executive branch cannot engage in actions that are reserved for the legislative branch, and neither can engage in actions reserved for the judicial branch. And the judicial branch obviously cannot engage in actions that are reserved for the executive or legislative branches. So that is how we have this system of checks and balances. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, when you have a SCOTUS that is so deeply aligned with the executive branch as we have now, that's when those lines begin to blur, or at least there's not as many checks on, say, the executive branch, for example. Anyways, I wanted to explain that because I think a lot of people have questions about how this works. And when you begin to see lawsuits, these are the things we're going to be looking at with these executive orders. Were they legal? Meaning, was the president overreaching and attempting to legislate from the executive office, which is a big no-no? And secondly, is the executive order constitutional? Is it a violation of the U.S. Constitution? And there's all the different amendments. There's lots of different bases by which an executive order could be considered unconstitutional. And that's what we're going to start seeing in the courts. And actually, we've already seen some filings this week. So anyways, I hope that helps. Let me know if you want me to explain anything else to you.